네, 이제 제3부를 시작하겠습니다. 프랑스 파리를 연결해 코로나 위기 이후 한국 경제에 대한 전망을 들어볼 건데요. 최근 OECD의 한국 경제 담당관으로 임명된 크리스토프 안드레의 분석이 있겠습니다. 이어서는 성태훈 연세대학교 경제학과 교수님과 앙드레 선임연구원이 우리나라 기업들이 코로나 위기를 극복하는 데 필요한 것이 무엇인지를 이야기 나누는 시간이 준비되어 있습니다. 먼저 크리스토프 앙드레 선임연구원을 소개합니다. I'd like to introduce Christophe Andre, the Senior Economics of Korea at the OECD. Hello, Mr. Andre.
Hello.
I'm so honored to have you here today. It is 6:30 a.m. in Paris, and thank you so much for joining the Herald Business Forum. Would you please give us a speech for 30 minutes from 6:30 to 7 a.m. local time in Paris?
Yes. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be in this forum. I'll start by saying a few words about the policy response to the COVID-19 crisis. First, there is a health crisis, and Korea has responded very well to this with a very effective epidemic containment strategy. And then, of course, there is an economic crisis that follows. And again, there has been quite a lot of fiscal and monetary policy support. Looking at this crisis, as in every crisis, of course, there is a lot of difficulty, but there are also opportunities. And you also need to think about the future, what the future world will be, and how you can adapt to this. And so it's important to strengthen the foundations for inclusive and green growth. Why inclusive and green growth? Well, first inclusive because inequality has increased in Korea over the past decades. And to some extent, inequality is necessary in an economic system to provide incentives, to encourage risk-taking, to encourage innovation. But at some point, it becomes counterproductive. It reduces demand, and social cohesion is also very important for society to function well. Why green growth? Because we have this global climate change challenge, and Korea must do its part to tackle it, but not only. Also, you have quite high air pollution in Korea, which is really important to tackle for health and well-being reasons, and also having an advantage in dealing with the environment is very important in terms of competitiveness, also for exports. So this is important for Korea to invest in these areas. Looking at long-term challenges, we know that Korea has the fastest aging population in the OECD. So it will be very important to mobilize very well the labor resources. There is a risk with this crisis that some people are durably excluded from the labor market. I'm thinking in particularly of young people, of women. So it's really important to keep these people close to the labor market. And also to facilitate the transitions, it's important to reinforce the social safety net. Some measures have been taken already during the crisis, but on a more permanent basis, it's important to have a strong social safety net. Then one of the characteristics of the Korean economy is that there is duality between large firms and SMEs, duality between industry and services, between regular and non-regular workers. So trying to have a more homogeneous economy is also very important. And then you need to boost productivity. Productivity at the aggregate level is about 20% below the OECD average. So there is room for improvement. And this can be done through digitalization and innovation. Also, the regulations need to adapt to the new world, especially in the digital fields. We have a lot of innovations. And of course, you want regulations to protect consumers, to protect people, to ensure safety. to protect privacy. But at the same time, you don't want regulation to hamper the development of new business models that are very valuable. I'm thinking, for example, of telemedicine, which has played a very important role in dealing with the health crisis. So that's on the product market side. On the labor market side, every crisis necessitates the reallocation of jobs. Some people are going to lose their jobs. They'll find jobs in other areas. It's important also to support this adaptation for the benefit of everyone. Then looking at the external side, it's important also for Korea to diversify its trade links. We are seeing a period of trade tensions between a number of countries, so it's important not to rely too much on a few trading partners. The global value chains are also very important. We've seen during the crisis that there were some disruptions. Actually, Korean firms have been pretty efficient, for example, when business was almost closed in China, to outsource from Southeast Asia instead. So there has been a reaction. It's important to continue to have resilient value chains. The solution is not really, to avoid international trade, to have reshoring, as some say. Some strategic activity may need to be reshored, but otherwise, international trade is very valuable, but you also need to make sure that the value chains are resilient. And finally, the investment in green technology and renewable energy is also very important to ensure sustainable growth. So I'll start with the policy responses to the COVID-19 crisis. And this chart illustrates fairly well what happened in Korea compared to other countries and why Korea is doing pretty well in economic terms. This is an indicator from Google, so they track people going to restaurants and shopping centers and this kind of places, and they look at the evolution. And you see that in Korea, at the peak of the epidemic, you had a fall of 40% in this mobility for retail and recreation. This is substantial, but if you compare with countries, in particular in Europe, where you have very large lockdowns, you see that the decline was about 90%. So Korea has been able to contain the epidemic without having so stringent lockdown that really hamper economic developments. And you see this in the numbers, and we've produced our latest forecast just last week. And now we expect the Korean economy to shrink by about 1% this year. This compares to a world economy that is expected to shrink by about 4.5%. Of course, there is a lot of uncertainty around these numbers, but what is pretty sure is that Korea will do better than the others. In terms of employment, we also see a non-negligible fall in employment, about 1%. But again, other countries are doing worse. Japan is almost similar. Germany has a slightly higher decline. But in European countries, actually, they have used a lot these job retention schemes that are sponsored by the government, where basically people work shorter hours and are paid to a large extent by the government. So this really limited the impact on employment in these countries, where you didn't have these kind of schemes in the United States and in Canada. Then you have a decline in employment, which is of 6-7% year on year, which is really a very, very big number. What happens in Korea, though, is that since you have a very dual labor market, some categories are deeply affected by the crisis. We've seen a decline in employment in wholesale and retail trade, in accommodation and food, which is very important, nearly 6%. And in these areas, you've got a lot of temporary workers, daily workers, self-employed. And in these categories, employment is shrinking a lot. So that's an important issue. That's also why the government has provided a number of measures, including in the fourth supplementary budget that is now presented to support these people. Monetary policy is also helping the recovery, and the Bank of Korea has taken a lot of measures to stabilize financial markets, to provide liquidity, and has cut its policy rates to 0.5. Now at 0.5, we are close to the lower bound, so there is not much more that can be done. What could be done if the situation really worsens is to go into unconventional measures, as many central banks around the world have done, so-called quantitative easing. For the moment, it's not really on the cards. It's a possibility if things worsen. You need to know also that there are some side effects. So there are some trade-offs. The risk of having too expansionary monetary policy is to have asset bubbles, also rising house prices. So there are some trade-offs there. And in any case, the room for monetary policy is now relatively limited. Where there is a bit more space is on the fiscal side. And I'm showing an estimate here for the budget balance of about 4%. This is an unofficial estimate because our latest official estimate is from June, so it's a bit outdated. And we will produce a true estimate in a month's time. But this is just to give an order of magnitude. And you've got a decline in the budget balance from a surplus of nearly 1% to a deficit of about 4%. So this is 5 points of GDP, and this provides significant support. Korea can afford this because it has low government debt, about 40% of GDP before the crisis. This is very low in OECD comparison. The OECD average is above 100%, and countries like Italy or Japan have much higher debt. So Korea has room. It has also a strong credit rating equivalent to France and the United Kingdom for government bonds. So there is room for stimulus for the moment. Of course, in the long term, you will need to ensure fiscal sustainability and to have credible plans for that. Now, looking at how we can strengthen the foundations for inclusive and green growth. First, we need to remark that growth has been slowing down even before the crisis. We had growth of 2% last year, which is pretty low for Korea, partly due to the weak semiconductor market last year. But still, there are factors that are weighing on growth. We expect a rebound for 2021, but this is just a rebound. And then probably growth is going to be a bit lower than in the past if no measures are taken, because there are factors that weigh on potential growth in Korea. And one of them is obviously the fast aging of the population. We see that if you look at the old age dependency ratio, which is the number of people aged 65 or over divided by the working age population, now Korea is at a bit more than 20%. It's one of the lowest in the OECD, so a young population, but it is expected to be the highest ratio in the OECD by 2060, much higher than Japan today. So the aging is very rapid, and that's a challenge for Korea. And Korea will have to mobilize its employment potential much better in the future if it wants to continue to grow at a fast pace. And if you want to look at where the potential is, it's pretty clear here that women after about 25 have very low employment rates. So the government has taken already some measures like reinforcing childcare and also trying to get a better work-life balance through shorter working hours, also job centers for women that help women rejoin the labor market. But it's really important to create opportunities for women. It's also important, if you look at the main panel, that young people are also entering the labor market a bit late. That's partly due to long studies, but that's also partly due to difficulties in integrating the labor market. And this is going to be worsened by the crisis. So it's really important to support young people. Coming back to women, the gender wage gap is the widest in the OECD. So that reflects partly the fact that women that come back to the labor market after having children are generally in non-regular jobs, and so they have lower salaries, but also the fact that the opportunities are not that great means that many women don't work, and that's we saw the fairly low employment rate just because there aren't enough opportunities. And that's really a waste, because Korean women on average are very well educated. A lot of them have tertiary education. So this is a potential that should be used better. Turning to older workers, the problem is a bit different. Older workers tend to work, partly because the pension system is not really mature, so it means that people have low revenue and they need to work. You see that for the prime age category, 25 to 54, you have an employment rate in Korea which is close to the OECD average. But then it increases, and actually Korea has the highest employment rate in the 70-74 category. The problem is that often these people retire from their career jobs in their 50s, and then they have non-regular jobs where they earn very, very little, and actually the poverty rate in Korea for older people is the highest in the OECD. So you can address this partly through transfers, but it's really important to allow people to continue to work in occupations where they can earn a decent living and where they are very productive. And so this is something that really needs to be tackled. Some people will say, okay, you provide more opportunities for old people, and this is going to be detrimental to youth. Well, that's not what we are observing in the OECD. If you look at OECD countries, the countries that have the highest employment rate for young people are also tend to be also the ones that have the highest rate for older people. So it means that labor markets that are working well work well for both young and old people, and there is no crowding out of youth by older workers. Of course, there are some characteristics that are a bit different in Korea and that have a role and that need to be addressed. The first one is that young people generally, because of the dual labor market, they prefer to work for big firms or for the public service. They are reluctant to go to SMEs, for example. So creating more opportunities there and changing the mindset is really important. The second thing is the seniority-based wage system, which is an obstacle to prolonging careers. You see that after 35, 40, wages don't increase that much in relative terms in Germany and the US. But for men in Korea and in Japan, the wages continue to increase, so older workers are much more expensive, and if they don't have higher productivity, firms are inclined to push them towards retirement, which is an issue. In Japan, they tend to rehire people at a lower wage. That's not completely satisfactory because in these lower quality jobs, they are not as productive as they could be. Now, after looking at employment and how to increase the labor resources for the economy, it's also important to look at productivity. And productivity remains relatively low in Korea. It's about 80% of the OECD average, even a bit lower if you measure by hours worked instead of by person. So there is an improvement that is possible. And the reason why you have This low productivity is that you have big differences between big firms that are very productive and SMEs with lower productivity, with differences between industry and small firms, and between regular and non-regular workers. Looking at the industry structure, so here 100 means the productivity of the overall economy, and you see then that in ICT manufacturing, Korea has a productivity which is 3 times the national average. That's much higher than what we see in other OECD countries. In other manufacturing also, productivity is very high. On the other hand, on services, even ICT services, productivity is not so high. So that's where improvement is possible, and especially in other business services. And other business services are very important because if you look at the second panel, you see that they account for about 40% of employment. So if you have 40% of your employment that is yielding low productivity, it's difficult to have a very high aggregate measure. So that's where progress is needed. And how can you improve productivity in small firms? Digitalization can play a very important role in this. And if you look at digitalization in Korea, small firms don't really use big data. And actually the plan, the data dam in the Korean New Deal is going to be very important from that perspective. Cloud computing can also be developed, and customer relationship management is also very low in small firms in Korea. So there are areas for improvement that would yield productivity gains. The regulatory environment is also important. It's even more important now that we are seeing a lot of technical change, of development of digitalization, of new tools. So it's important to have a regulation that is adapted, that both protects the consumer and the businesses, and also allows the development of innovative business models. Public ownership in Korea is similar to the OECD average, but public ownership in itself is not always a problem. It depends on the governance. And if you see Sweden, for example, they have a lot of public companies, but they are really run on a market basis, on a competitive basis. There is very little government interference. In Korea, as you see in the involvement in business operations bar, you see that Korea is doing less well than the OECD average. So there is more government interference, which can be counterproductive in some cases. On the other hand, Korea is doing very well in terms of simplification and evaluation of regulations. You have also this experience of sandboxes, which will lead to an evolution of regulation. This is very good. You have an administrative burden on startups, which is close to the OECD average. But you have barriers in service and network sectors that are higher than in the OECD, and also barriers to trade and investment that are higher. And this is an issue, especially in this period where things are moving very fast. In terms of exports, you see that the exports of Korea are fairly concentrated. About 40% of exports go to either the United States or China, and of course there have been trade tensions between these two countries, so that can prove problematic. This is a vulnerability for Korea, so Korea needs to try to diversify its exports, and actually it has created a lot of free trade agreements with countries. As the representative of a multilateral organization, I would say free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements are second best, but in the current political situation globally, they are very valuable. And so this is important. The reinforcement of relations with Asian countries is very important. We have seen also a lot of developments in trade and investment between Korea and the European Union, which is a big trading bloc too. So it is quite important. These developments are going in the right direction. By product type, there is a trade-off, because if you're very competitive in an area like semiconductors, of course it brings big benefits. But when the market falls, then you are vulnerable. So there are some trade-offs, and Korea, if you take electronics, chemicals, and motor vehicles, they account for almost 2/3 of Korean exports. So this is a vulnerability, and maybe more diversification would be desirable. And finally, growth needs to become greener. CO2 intensity has come down, but it is still much higher than the OECD average. And it is much higher because Korea is an industrial country with a strong manufacturing base. So it has more emissions than countries that are importing manufactured goods and mainly producing services. But still, even if you take this into account, the emissions are pretty high in Korea. Korea is burning quite a lot of coal. And you see this also in air pollution, although air pollution is also coming from neighboring countries, but part of it is produced in Korea. And you see that the situation regarding the exposure to PM 2.5, so that's basically fine dust, the situation has improved since 2000, but a large share of the population is still exposed to very high levels of air pollution. If you compare with the OECD below, where you have a lot of green, you don't see this in Korea. So this is important to tackle for health reasons, for the well-being of people. An advantage of Korea is that it has strong technology overall, and an increasing share of inventions is in the environment-related sector. Now it's a bit higher than, the share is a bit higher than the OECD average, and more importantly, it has risen much more over the past 15 years than in other OECD countries. So technology is an important response to climate change. It can bring a lot in terms of competitive advantage on international markets. And of course, it's not sufficient. You will need also carbon pricing for the emission trading scheme, and you need also regulations to avoid pollution, but technology is important and is an asset for Korea. And I will end up with this, and if you want more details, you can look at our survey that we released just last month, where you will find a lot more detail. Thank you for your attention.
I appreciate all your analysis and prospect of Korea economy. Please put hands together for Mr. Andre. 수고해주신 앙드레 선임연구원께 감사의 박수를 부탁드립니다. Now we will have a special discussion with Professor Sung Tae-yoon and Mr. Andre for 40 minutes. 바로 이어서 성태윤 연세대 경제학과 교수님과 앙드레 선임연구원의 대담을 진행하겠습니다. 성태윤 교수님을 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Okay, it's my honor to have this discussion with Christopher, and then I have seen your excellent presentation on the Korean economy. Let me begin today's discussion with me by asking you have mentioned that Korea has relatively mild recession. Can you give why that could happen in Korea relative to other countries? Can you give your idea, please?
Well, the main reason is that Korea has been able to contain the pandemic much better than other countries. In many countries, you had very important restrictions on movement, sometimes complete lockdowns in countries like France, Italy, or the United Kingdom. And of course, people couldn't go shopping and couldn't go to restaurants, etc. So the decline in activity has been very high. In Korea, the Korean authorities have been very efficient in detecting cases, in testing, in then isolating people and avoiding complete lockdowns as we could see elsewhere. So I think that this is what really makes the difference. Of course, there was also a lot of government support through monetary policy, through fiscal policy, but that we have seen also in other countries. So this, this is very important, but this doesn't really make a difference with other countries.
Yeah, right. As you just mentioned, the other countries also have the monetary and fiscal policies, but relative to other countries, we believe the containment of the pandemic was relatively effective in Korea. As a result of that, we don't need to decrease the consumption, especially the face-to-face consumption relative to other countries, as you just mentioned. But some people worry about the case that when there is the no limit or there is a improvement in the situation of a pandemic, then relatively the Korea might have the also the mild recovery relative to other countries. For example, the other countries are depending on heavily the domestic consumption, but in the Korean economy is heavily depending on external sectors such as export. As a result of that, when there is a recession, the recovery period, there might be relatively the mild recovery in Korea. What about your opinion at that kind of analysis?
Yes, I think that's true. There will be a rebound in other countries, and there will be also a rebound in Korea. Of course, since the recession has been milder, you will see lower growth rates in Korea, but in terms of level, Korea will still be at a higher level than other countries. I agree that exports are the main question mark, and this really depends on the recovery elsewhere. The domestic economy seems on the right footing. Of course, with the resurgence of the virus since mid-August, we've seen a new drop in consumption, but things seem to improve on the health front with less cases now. So probably distancing measures can be eased progressively, and consumption will come back. The fourth supplementary budget will also help. So consumption shouldn't be too bad, and then investment is promoted by the Korean New Deal and by very low interest rates. So on the domestic front, I'm pretty confident about the future of the Korean economy. Now on exports, it's very difficult to tell because it really depends on what's happening in the rest of the world, and of course, Korea is very vulnerable. It depends on sectors though, because you've seen a rebound in the exports of semiconductors. Now everyone is going digital, so everything that is linked to electronics is working pretty well. On the other hand, you have other sectors that are suffering much more, like petrochemicals, like cars, and there the uncertainty is quite big. But I mean, okay, in terms of relative performance, the problem is that if the other countries are doing badly, Korea will also suffer through its exports.
Okay, so as you just mentioned, there is a big discrepancy between the semiconductor industries and non-semiconductor industries in Korea. So even though we have this pandemic situation, the demand for semiconductor industry was still strong. So relatively, it was contributing to the Korean economy. Then you think how do you evaluate the contribution of semiconductor industry in terms of the Korean economy's growth trend and also in some risk factors? Can you give your idea?
Well, yes. I mean, overall, Overall, the exports are about 40% of the Korean economy, and semiconductors are an important part of exports too, as I've shown in my presentation. So it means that when semiconductor exports are strong, it contributes quite a lot to the economy. Now, of course, we've seen last year that there was a drop in demand for semiconductors, and growth went down quite significantly in Korea. So this is a vulnerability. It seems that after this weak patch last year, there is both a natural rebound from a low level, and that is accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis, which incites people to go more digital. So I think we can be fairly optimistic, but it's a very volatile sector. So there can be also a decline at some point, but now we are more in a recovery phase.
Okay, so I think I understand that you are in charge of Korea and also Sweden desk, right? So
Yes.
and we know that there was a big difference between the Korea and the Sweden in responding to the COVID-19. So can you give that idea, and also what was the impact on the Korea and Swedish economies? Can you?
Well, Sweden has taken a very different strategy in dealing with the epidemic, and the dealing with it's very early to say compared to other European countries, to Nordic countries. Now we're seeing that Sweden has more deaths, but it's difficult to know whether it's really linked to the policies, and you need to see in the long term what the impact is on health. And I'm not a health expert, so it's very difficult to assess the health policy. But what some people thought was that with less severe confinement in Sweden than in other European countries, you would have a lower impact on the economy, but actually this did not really happen. Sweden is not doing much better than its neighbors. So in terms of comparison with other European countries, Sweden is still suffering. Obviously, they've been less efficient than Korea in dealing with the health crisis, but now they're also giving quite a lot of support for policy, and hopefully things are going to improve too.
Okay, then also we understand that Sweden has a very similar structure in terms of export-oriented economic structure, relative to other European countries. So then you think you can find that difference in industry structure in responding to COVID-19, or having the impact from COVID-19 on Swedish economy and the other European countries in terms of the dependence on external sector?
Well, yes, Sweden is dependent on exports too, and perhaps more importantly, it's really dependent on exports to other European countries. So that also makes a difference with Korea, because now we see that the recession is less severe than we had previously expected in China and the United States. Actually, China is even expected to grow this year, and it's a big market for Korea, much more than for Sweden. The United States is also a big market for Korea, and the reduction in activity will be less in the United States than in Europe. So the situation is more difficult for Sweden. But of course, I mean the problem for Sweden is pretty much the same as for Korea, that exports are going to be a great determinant of their growth performance.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned the impact on particularly on the non-regular workers. And then we know that in the Korean economy, non-regular workers got serious impact from this COVID-19 situation, especially they had a big trouble in the unemployment or the wage stability or something like that. So can you but we might think that if there are non-regular workers in other European countries, we might expect that kind of thing also even in European countries. Then do you think what makes that difference between the Korean economy and the European economies or other advanced economies?
Well, I think there are big differences across advanced economies. In Europe, generally, we have a pretty strong social safety net. So, of course, you've got a number of temporary workers that suffer in every country. But actually, they are less numerous than in Korea. And also, generally, you have more support on a regular basis, like a stronger unemployment insurance. So this is what we see in European countries. And in addition, this time, generally you had some job retention schemes. So schemes where this is more for regular workers, but companies keep their workers even if they have less activity, and workers work part-time and sometimes don't work at all, and a large share of their salary is paid by the government. And this has limited the fall in employment in European countries. In the United States, you have a fall of employment that is much bigger. That's the way the US labor market works. And of course, there you have also a lot of temporary workers or workers with little protection, and they have also suffered quite a lot.
Right. So you just mentioned in some sense a difference between the U.S. economy and the European cases. Then, as you know, in the U.S., the federal government of the U.S. has provided some cash subsidies for the quite big group of people, so to support to help those people who are in trouble due to the COVID-19. But relatively, we think that did not happen in European countries relatively. So then or do you think the European countries seem to have the similar structure, or they had the similar structure even with social safety net, did they? Or you think that there was a difference? Then how we can justify that difference?
Well, the big difference is that in European countries, you have a lot of built-in stabilizers. So people have basically insurance, and when they get out of jobs, they get some unemployment benefits. When they have some that are not eligible to unemployment benefits, they have other kinds of support, and this is built in the system. In the US, you have much less, a much weaker social safety net. But in terms of when there is a crisis, they are taking exceptional measures to support people. So that's the big difference between the two countries. In this crisis, in addition to all that is built in the system, the European countries also took some additional measures. I mentioned these job retention schemes, and there were additional measures for small businesses, for example. So this is an exceptional crisis. So there have been measures taken also, discretionary measures taken also in Europe. But generally, it's just the way the system works, where things are more automatic in Europe, and in the US you take discretionary measures. But there is very strong social support in Europe.
Okay, so there is some debate on the built-in system that you just mentioned in Korea, in the sense that if we design that built-in system wrongly or not in a right way, then they can create a big burden for the government's debt or the fiscal soundness. What about your opinion on the kind of analysis? Right, of course, we understand that built-in system is pretty good in making make that system work in the crisis or in the recession. But if that system is not properly built, then they can create the fiscal problem. So, what about your opinion on that kind of analysis?
Yeah, yes, I fully agree. Design is essential. And we've seen some problems in some European countries in the past where the social system was creating disincentives to work. And then you get lower growth, you get a higher fiscal cost, and you're in a pretty bad position. I mean, you need to create both support, but also the incentives for work. And if you look at Sweden, it's very interesting because Sweden has a very comprehensive safety net, but also has good incentives, good labor market policies, and they have the highest employment rate in the European Union. Because the system is really well designed and they really try to put people into work. That's what is necessary. If people get out of work, they get insurance, so they get some money during the period they are unemployed, and they also get training to get new jobs, and that's the way the system works. So there is protection, but there are also very strong incentives for people to work, and this is very important. That's the key in the design of the social safety nets.
Okay, thank you. So you just mentioned as the example the Sweden, and then you just mentioned how they design to make it work. So I fully appreciate your analysis. And what about the other countries which have experienced the fiscal crisis in, for example, the 2010 or something like that? Those countries still have the improper system, or do you think they are trying to correct that system? Because we have a big debate on that issue. So.
Well, I think the fiscal crisis is not directly related to the social safety net. It can be related, but it's not necessarily just related to the social safety net. I mean, in some countries they had, for example, very generous pension schemes. In some countries, they had a quite inefficient administration. So, I mean, you need an efficient government, and that covers all areas, not just the social safety net. I mean, the countries, I think that get in trouble, and I think this is very important. And again, Sweden and other Nordic countries are a good example in that respect. Is that fiscal policy really needs to be counter-cyclical, and the countries that get in trouble are the countries that don't put their house in order when the economy is good. When you have a recession, you need to spend more, you get less income from taxes, and you get a big deficit, and that's not really a big issue. The problem is that if you start a crisis and you already have a big deficit, then you get into trouble. So I think it's really important to have a strong fiscal framework with a strong long-term vision, and then to avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policies. And especially in good times, you really need to reduce your deficit.
Okay, so can you give the examples of countries or economies which have the sound control system on that kind of a fiscal situation? As you just mentioned, I also agree that the fiscal crisis is directly related to the social welfare system, there are many other issues, many other reasons. So I fully agree with what you said. But as you just mentioned, it is also, but even in the case, it is also important to have sound fiscal fiscal status when we are facing the crisis. So then, because we need a room for fiscal stimulus, we still believe. So you think, can you give the idea on the country or economy examples that could have a good room for fiscal stimulus? In your analysis, in your view?
Well, I mentioned the Nordic countries. I mean, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. These countries had actually a very big crisis in the 1990s with very big deficits, and then they modified completely their system and their management of public finances, and now they are very efficient. But another example closer to your region is Australia, which also has very sound fiscal policies. So these are examples that can be followed. And actually, the common point also between these countries is that they are both very committed to long-term fiscal soundness and also very reactive. They can have a deficit when the economy is bad, but then when the economy gets better, they will consolidate their fiscal position. So they avoid the kind of problems we've seen in some countries that in the middle of a recession, they try to reduce the deficit, and that proves counterproductive. So they have both the long-term target and the flexibility.
So you just mentioned the very important concepts, the long-term, in some sense target, and some flexibility in fiscal policy. I think in that sense, currently the Korean economy, Korean government is also trying to have some stimulus package for the boosting the Korean economy during this crisis. But while we are adopting the kind of policy, we also need to maintain the sustainable fiscal status. Then, can you give any ideas or suggestion how we can really make it happen? So you can just say we can say efficient government, but rather than just saying efficient government, what can be a good institutional suggestion or the policy suggestion you think?
Well, there are a lot of ways to deal with the issue. I mean, the main thing is commitment. I talked about Australia, and actually the fiscal rules in Australia are not very strict. But the governments have all been committed to fiscal sustainability. I think it's important both to have an assessment of where you're going in terms of public finances, and then to take the appropriate measures. First you need to decide what kind of public services you need to provide, then try to provide them in an efficient way. And if providing public services in an efficient way requires higher taxes, you need to raise taxes. If you don't want to raise taxes, you need to contain the expenditure. That's largely a social choice. But you need to have a clear vision about this, and you need to monitor the situation. And for the moment, okay, stimulus is really important. It will need to be kept for a while because the escape from this crisis will be pretty slow. But when the economy becomes better, it's going to be necessary to put back the fiscal situation on a sustainable path. So there are a lot of measures. I mean, it's both micro measures for efficiency, and also having a picture about the evolution of debt that you can afford, the level of debt where you want to get to, and adjusting spending and revenue according to this. And if you have to raise taxes, it's very important that you raise taxes that are not too detrimental to growth. For example, in Korea, you have relatively low VAT, So if you increase a bit VAT, it doesn't have a big impact on growth. If you increase direct taxes, you have the risk of having a bigger impact on growth, and then it's problematic. So you need to look at all these issues.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you have mentioned or you have proposed the many factors that as the long-term structural problems in the Korean economy. So if you pick up the really the biggest issue that we should tackle with in the Korean economy to have the sustainable growth, can you pick up or propose the one really important issue out of the many issues?
Well, I think one issue which I would perhaps, let's start with one, but maybe there are two important issues. But the first one I would say is, since the population is aging rapidly,
Right.
It's very important to increase participation. And I think in particular the participation of women, not only in terms of employment rate, but also in terms of quality of jobs. Korean women are very well educated, so it's really important that they have a greater place in the economy. Also young people, it's important to have them finding good jobs. It's also important for older workers to increase the quality of their jobs. People will continue to work. That's very good that people work longer. We're trying in Europe to have people work longer, but we don't want them to work in very low quality jobs. That's the issue. So for that, you need to invest in lifelong training. You probably have to revise seniority wages. So this is the main question, trying to cope with aging by increasing the employment rate. And the second issue I would mention is productivity. And to improve productivity, you have very strong international firms that are very productive, but you need to also have an improvement in all the SME sector, small enterprises, small businesses. They need to become more productive to enhance the overall productivity of the Korean economy.
Okay, so if I interpret what you just said as the issue of a population and labor market issue, my interpretation is correct as the most important part.
Yeah, I think this is really important, and it also contributes to the second part, because if you get people in good jobs, you will get higher productivity.
So
I mean, this is really the key.
Right. As a result of that, we will have higher productivity. So, okay. So that's a good point. So, but you just mentioned the very important point on the population issue in Korea. But as you know, according to OECD data, the Korea has the highest poverty ratio in the old-aged people. Among the OECD countries, I guess, one of the highest countries.
Yeah.
So then, you think how we can overcome the kind of issue? Can you give your suggestion or analysis?
Yes, I think the short term. The short-term issue is largely about transfers. I mean, some people have very low revenue, and actually the government has already taken some measure to transfer some money to poorer households. So you can also improve some schemes. You can have a higher basic pension. You can also the basic livelihood support can also be improved. For the moment, you have this sort of family obligation that creates a means test. So this is an issue, and it's going to be tackled in the New Deal arrangements. We had some similar dispositions in European countries, and they have been removed. So I think transfers can help, but only to some extent. I think the long-term issue is really to improve the quality of jobs for older workers. This is this people shouldn't be forced to retire in their 50s from their career job and take a secondary job which is low paid. I mean, you need to keep these people in working in very high quality jobs, and for this you need different institutional arrangements. You need also more training. Lifelong training is going to be a very important challenge, not only for Korea, but also for other countries, because the economy is evolving very fast. So people need to retrain to acquire new skills, and this is really important to invest in this. And then if people retire from their career jobs at 65, then there will be much less of an issue with old age poverty.
So you have just mentioned, I think the very important point that people should not be forced to retire depending on age. According to age, the people should not forced to retire. But there is the another view or the analysis that if we abolish that retirement system, that can have a big impact or negative big impact on the youth unemployment, the young aged people's the unemployment issue, under the current Korea's wage system, because our wage system still depends on age, and age or seniority has a big impact on the wage determination. Is if we still maintain that system, then if we abolish the system that forcing the old age people to retire, then as a result of that can have a big impact on youth age. So what about your opinion on that kind of the suggestion?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that, as I've shown in my presentation, there is a positive correlation across OECD countries between youth employment and older worker employment. So it's not impossible to get a win-win deal. Now, of course, there are institutional factors in Korea that are not favorable, and the seniority wages are a problem. So it's going to be important to try to align the wages with productivity, and I think there should be some negotiations between the employers and the trade unions on this. I mean, one strength of the model in the Nordic countries is that you have a very strong social dialogue. And I mean, if you think of this issue of older workers, if these older workers that gets lower wages than they do for the moment with seniority wages, but they keep their job, they are anyway going to earn more than when they go to the non-regular sector. So I mean, it's also beneficial for workers perhaps to have a bit lower wages in their career jobs, but not to have to go to the non-regular sector after 50 something. So the employers can also see advantages in keeping experienced workers. So this is not an easy issue, but this is an issue that cannot be solved completely by the government, and that's where social dialogue is very important. And so I really would encourage trade unions and employers to negotiate on that and to find a relevant solution. And of course, the government can help, for example, in providing opportunities for training of people so that they still arrive at a more advanced age with very good skill. So this, every stakeholder has to take its responsibilities and try to improve the system. It's not going to happen overnight, but that's the direction you need to move in, especially with the aging of the population. You will have more and more older workers. And if you want to have a competitive and a fast-growing economy, you really need to solve this issue.
So while you have your presentation, and as you know, the Korean government is trying to have the digital New Deal to have the more digital transformation by investing more the fiscal the money in various digital infrastructure. So basically, they try to decrease the gaps of the digitalization between large and small firms, but not just the digitalization in other aspects. There is a huge gap between the large firms and small firms. I think that is not just in Korea, in many other countries, even though we might have the more serious discrepancy between small and medium-sized firms and large firms, but we have maintained the huge program to support small and medium-sized enterprises, but so far, even though we have invested so much money, but the current result doesn't seem to be so successful. Then after you indicate that difference, then how we can overcome that discrepancy between the large companies and small and medium-sized companies. So some analysts say it is natural, or some analysts say it is inevitable, something like that. But you think that it is inevitable, or we can reduce that problem?
No, I think it's not inevitable, and you know, in a market economy, you need competition. And you know what happens, for example, in the US with all the big firms that like Amazon, Google, etc., that have increasing monopoly power is worrying. So we need to tackle this. All countries need to tackle this. And of course, in Korea, you already had a very strong discrepancy between big firms and small firms, but it is really important to create a level playing field for everyone. That's important for the consumer, that's important for the citizen, that's important for innovation, for the dynamism of the economy. You don't want an economy that is just run by a few monopolists. So this is decisive. And I think in terms of government support, the problem with government support to SMEs in the past in Korea is that it has often just, you know, helped a number of firms that were not growing, that were not very innovative to survive. So it was, you know, a sort of life assistance, but it didn't really help these companies to grow. So what is important is really to help these companies, these small companies, to integrate an ecosystem, and so more cooperation also between small and big companies on a more equal footing is important. We suggested in our survey also that you could have some innovation vouchers given to small companies, so that they can digitalize, they can innovate more. So the support should be really to growing firms and to allow them to develop. And I think, for example, in terms of data, it's very important what the government is doing with the data dam, because small firms in the digitalized world, it's more difficult for them to access data sources. So having platforms that allow small firms to get access to this resource is important for their growth. It's important for competition too.
Okay, thank you. So we have just had this productive discussion about for 35 minutes, I guess, almost. Then we only have 5 minutes. I think while we have this long discussion on the Korean economy, I think that you have already given the really good advices and the excellent analysis on the Korean economy. As a wrap up the remark, so if you have any suggestion or the advices for the Korean economy in terms of the in fighting against or the in managing this COVID-19 situation, and also in terms of the structural change in the Korean economy, can you give, please?
Yes, I mean, in terms of managing the crisis, I've been really impressed by the reactivity of the government, I must say, both in the health treatment of the pandemic and also in the economic treatment, the economic support that is provided. So the government needs to continue, and also the Bank of Korea needs to continue to be supportive of the economy until the recovery is firmly established. And then it's really important that the investments that are made, especially the Korean New Deal, it's really important that it's effectively implemented, that it raises the growth potential. Also from a fiscal point of view, it's important because if you generate higher growth, you will have higher revenue, and then your fiscal situation will be better. So this is really important, and I think then you need to keep in mind these long-term issues, aging, which requires raising employment, especially for women, young people, increasing the quality of jobs for older people, and then the second one is tackling the productivity issue. And this is about helping SMEs to digitalize, to become more innovative, and to reduce the gap between the big companies and the SMEs. And this, I think, it's not easy, but these are the recipe for a future successful Korean economy.
Okay, once again, thanks a lot for your excellent presentation and this productive and fruitful discussion with on the Korean economy. And once again, thanks a lot for participating in this forum. So please give a big round of the applause to Christopher Andret. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure discussing with you about the Korean economy.
Thank you.
Mr. Andre and Professor Sung, thank you so much for your time with us. We are very lucky that we have had the chance to listen to your special discussion. Thank you. Goodbye. 수고해주신 성태윤 교수님과 앙드레 연구원 두 분께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다. 이상으로 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020을 마치겠습니다. 오랜 시간 함께해 주신 분들께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 지금까지 사회의 정세희 기자였습니다. 안녕히 돌아가십시오.